Hi, I'm Scott Warner, president of the Culinary Historians of Chicago. And Kathy just mentioned, well, this month is our 31st anniversary. We started 31 years ago, and I've been in since the beginning. And what a thrill this has been for 31 years to be involved with this group. Tonight we have Raeanne Sarazen. I've known Raeanne for years. She used to come to the culinary historians meetings years ago, and she met our founding president, Bruce Craig, and Carol Haddix, the food editor of the Tribune, used to come. And Bruce introduced us, correct me if I'm wrong, Raeanne, Bruce introduced Raeanne to Carol, who hired her as test kitchen director for the Tribune. And that was just one of the beginnings of her marvelous career. So I'll tell you a little bit about Raeanne. She's a registered dietitian and chef. She's worked for Charlie Trotter, Wolfgang Puck. I mean, I'll just mention those two. So, you know, where do you go from there? That's not chopped liver. She combines over 20 years of experience producing recipe content, as again, test kitchen director for the Tribune, food writer and editor. Her writing and recipes have appeared in the Chicago Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, Cooking Light, and Better Homes and Gardens, among other places. Right now, she is the author of what I personally think is the best reference work ever written on recipe writing. It's her book is called The Complete Recipe Writing Guide, a comprehensive resource for food professionals on developing, writing, and publishing successful recipe content. Now, why would anybody be interested in that who isn't a professional? I think it's fascinating to find out what goes into recipes. I always used to think you just wrote down like add 3 eggs, add some milk, stir, scramble, fry. It's amazing. It takes almost genius to have a simple recipe where you have delicious food that you have a recipe for it in black and white, and people can produce a wonderful meal. Julia Child was the example of somebody who could take your hand and guide you through everything. They said her recipes were complicated. I don't know that they were complicated. They were involved. If you followed her recipe, you couldn't make a mistake. So Raeanne is giving you, for those of us who are interested, I think everybody's curious, what goes into writing a recipe? It is not as simple as it looks. And there's also something called headnotes in there, which Hemingway would have been qualified to write headnotes. It takes such artistry for that. But Raeanne's book is nominated for, she's a finalist. The book is a finalist at the International Association of Culinary Professionals Conference. That's like the Academy Awards for cookbooks, and that's coming up next week in Brooklyn. I'll be there too to hopefully, I think she's going to win the award. I'm only 99% sure, but it's a masterpiece. And Raeanne's going to tell about the history of recipes, what goes into writing a recipe. I think you'll be amazed, and a whole bookload of things tonight for us. And she's going to reference her book that you can see behind her, The Complete Recipe Writing Guide. Yes, you got it. And Raeanne is in Chicago now. Yes. We're actually having somebody from Chicago tonight. We've been Zooming all over the country wonderfully. And tonight we have somebody right in our backyard. So anyway, without any further ado, Raeanne, come on down.
All right. I hope everybody can hear me. So I am really, really excited to be here tonight. I have been a member to the Culinary Historians since 1993. And that was when Bruce Craig was president. Louis Sadmari, who was then the owner and chef of the bakery on Lincoln Avenue, was an active member. And I have just always loved all of the meetings that was back then. And I currently love all the type of meetings that Catherine and Scott work so hard to put on. They always have such great speakers. They have great topics. And I always find that this organization has satiated my curiosity about food, food history, and really any topic that almost anybody who loves this area of food would find this organization to be something to be a part of. And I have been a part of it for a long time. Just glad that I'm finally a speaker here after all these years. I guess 31 years. This is my first time as a speaker, but I always find that by coming to these groups, I always have felt over the years that even if I knew a topic, I always felt like I could see it from a different perspective, or I could add a layer of depth to what I already knew. So I'm just glad that I'm here tonight, and I'm about to, share more about recipes. And speaking of that, as Scott said, I am a registered dietitian and classically trained chef, and I have worked in the food industry for over 25 years. I have always had recipes sort of at the central axis of everything that I ever have done in recipes. So when I was a clinical dietitian working in hospitals, recipes played a role. When I was a cook in restaurant kitchens, obviously recipes played a role. And as a food editor, writer, and test kitchen professional, food publishing, recipes have obviously played a role. So in the consulting work that I currently do, recipes are still pretty central. Sometimes I'm looking at it from a bigger perspective, trying to help nonprofits or food companies with their food and recipe content strategy. So not so much working directly on the recipes, but other times I get hired out to do testing, the editing, or even the development. So it kind of runs the gamut. And then for anybody who really knows about sort of the movement in food and health today, I am helping different healthcare organizations with curriculum for teaching medical students about culinary medicine, of course, of which recipes play a role there as well. So in terms of my book, it's sort of an interesting thing. It's kind of actually good that I'm speaking tonight, Scott and Catherine, although I think we lost Catherine. I don't know if she's behind there. That the 1-year anniversary, hi, Catherine. 1-year anniversary is this month. The book was published last year. I've spent a lot of time just sort of talking, and, I could almost do a whole separate talk on how much harder it is to actually market a book than it actually is to write it. But writing the book actually took a long time. It was about almost 5-year process. And let me just give you a little bit of background on how the book came to be and how it came to be that I was the one who was the author of it. So my book is published by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and they were looking for a book on recipe writing for their members. They saw that a lot of dietitians were in non-traditional settings, creating recipes for food companies or for PR agencies, or they were having their own blogs and creating a lot of recipes. And if anybody knows anything about dietitians, we have a really strong nutrition science background. We have a strong depth of understanding of diet in relation to disease prevention and management, but our academic background does not include anything within the culinary sphere. And so they knew that a book like this would be something that they would want their members to have. They wanted to have standards and guidelines that they could turn to as a book that's offered. And I guess for me, I knew that I really wanted to be the person to write this book for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. But one thing that I also knew really well was that, though I really did want to pay it forward to other dietitians, because I felt like when I was starting out, I wished I had a book like this. But I also knew very, very well that there were chefs that were super creative, but they couldn't write a recipe. I knew writers that were exceptional writers that couldn't cook very well. And I also knew healthcare professionals who are, whether they're doctors, dietitians, nurses, that they really couldn't translate their dietary recommendations into recipes or to real life advice. And so I feel like the Academy knew to come to me because I kind of had all of those parts of me at the intersection of what my knowledge base and experience was. Scott and I talked a lot about what the title of this program should be, which is sort of funny. I love the mincing of words and everything. And so Scott and I came up with this idea of the meticulous process of recipe writing, because there really is so much work that goes on sort of behind the scenes of creating recipe content. And my book itself covers all of this. So when we talk about the meticulous process, you could really talk about how all this work that sort of goes on. And I think this book, even though it's titled The Complete Recipe Writing Guide, recipe writing kind of runs a gamut. So the first 6 chapters of this book cover guidelines for recipe development, for health and wellness, and for people who really want to understand how to translate dietary recommendations for the prevention and management of different health conditions, or in this case, maybe diseases. And it's really unique because there really isn't a book out there that does this well. And it could be anything from developing recipes for food allergies and intolerances, for gluten-free, developing recipes for plant-based, or even modifying fat, salt, and sugar in recipes. So that part kind of makes it unique. The chapter on recipe writing and editing is just a super long, dense chapter. And I think that alone could really serve as the AP style guide for food writing and editing. It is truly super detail oriented, and something that I would even just get the book just for that chapter. Then it goes on to the best practices and guidelines for professional recipe testing, for professional nutrition analysis of recipes, and then also for really useful tips for food styling, photography, and video. And what makes it also really interesting about this book, that I was the author on it, but it was peer reviewed. So every chapter went out to anywhere from 3 to 9 different professionals. I also interviewed so many people for this book, partially because, like everything, I kind of go down a rabbit hole. I'm sort of like this journalist that wants to find out so much from others, because I think so many other professionals carry so much information around in their heads. And throughout the book, there are tips from really, wonderful experts in the field. And of course, there are appendices, etc. So tonight, though, we're not going to be able to cover everything in the book, but I tried my best to sort of start by giving an overview with the behind the scenes of what goes into recipe writing. And then, because of course it's the Culinary Historians of Chicago, I felt like this was something that I would love to do, which is sort of just give a brief overview or history of the recipe format or structure and how it's changed over the years. And I thought I would end on sort of just giving everybody 5 tips for writing better recipes. That could be whether you do it professionally, if you want to create a family cookbook, or you just want to start documenting them yourself for your own posterity. Somehow, I think you'll be able to find something in the takeaways helpful. And I guess the only thing I would want to share that's in addition, that when I wrote my introduction to this book, and Scott, I think you'll appreciate this, or all the longtime historians, I really wanted to write a whole introduction about the history in real detail about recipe writing. And that idea was kind of nixed. But anyway. So just to start out, as everybody knows, why do we need this book? It's partially because there's just this explosion of recipe content. So when I started in 1990, most of the recipes appeared in magazines, newspapers, and cookbooks, and they were really created by a select few professionals. They were food writers, they were test kitchen professionals, and home economists and cookbook authors. But what happened was in 1997, blogging started, and that sort of democratized all content creation, and there was just this huge explosion. But here we are, I guess I don't know if I'm doing my math right, like 27 years later, and there's more ways than ever to share content. There is all the social platforms like TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. There are digital-only publications like Food 52 and Serious Eats. And of course, what's so big right now are these Substack newsletters, which have lots of recipes as well. So I guess what's interesting about this is that the recipes are seemingly so simple from the user, from the reader's perspective, that nobody would know, like when you have to churn out all this constant recipe content, that it would be so hard. But that's what I'm here to tell you. The recipes appear simple, but they're not. Producing recipe content takes a lot of time, resources, effort, and a lot of skill. And I think that that is very true, because I know people over the years that have tried to blog, career changers that started to do a lot of recipes, and they just didn't know how to do it because they kind of got burnt out and they just, decided not to. And for a lot of people who've been super successful, they wind up oftentimes hiring and somehow gathering a food media team. So I think on that point, it's just like it's just a lot harder than one thinks. And in this is sort of a process, which is the behind the scenes. And even though I sort of wrote it down in steps like this, there's the recipe development, writing, and testing. It's almost more like a circle. Those things happen all sort of together or overlapping, going back and forth. Then there's the recipe editing and copy editing, nutrition analysis, food styling, photography, and video. So these are sort of the behind the steps that really require people to, I don't want to say be experts in each area, but I always say that if you don't know one area, you can hire out for another. So I would describe the very first step is the creative process or art of creating an original dish or modifying an existing dish. And every creative person has their own process. And the development process takes a lot longer than one might think. So for me, my creative process is, and always has been, it's sort of brainstorming. And the iPhone has helped me so much because I jot down all my notes that I find that could be helpful for any future recipe development project, or even if something I want to look up for future. I sometimes will brainstorm and write things down when I travel, when I'm eating at a restaurant. I have a note on an app on my phone that I'll take pictures or take the restaurant menu. And it's just a great way to keep track of all your ideas. Then I do lots of recipe research because for that, there are so many great books that already exist that have been done by people, including, as Scott has said, the Julia Child books, the Claudia Rodan books, Diana Kennedy. So it's like, there's so much that you can go and look at and kind of, when you want to develop something, see how somebody else has done it. And I know that there is the quick internet search and looking at all these different recipes, but I oftentimes, and you can see from my office behind me, I love certain tried and true books that I can go to because I could really trust those authors. There's a lot of experimenting in the kitchen. Then I always say I never go into the kitchen without first writing a recipe draft to work from. So then it's preparing it, adjusting it, rewriting it. And obviously this kind of goes into, this is writing, testing, development. It's all sort of in this one stage, which takes a very long time. And then the next stage, and I guess I have these titled the recipe workflow. And just to be clear, that's kind of how I've always thought of the work that I've done, is that it does go through a whole workflow process, starting with development and then at writing, which I would define as translating the act of cooking into words. It is sort of, to me, like the roadmap that you take somebody through on how to get from the beginning to the very final dish. And what's unique about writing is it's the language and literary skills. So it's about clarity and spelling and grammar. And it's really how the writer instructs the reader and what you want that reader to do. And to say how it's different than development, I kind of go back to working with a lot of chefs, is that chefs can be so creative in the recipes that they create. But I have seen how they then can't even if I'm working on a project and I'll call them and I'll say, what did you mean by X, Y, and Z? They won't even be able to recall either what they did, or they can't even understand their recipe very well. So I think it's, or they really appreciate all the hundreds of questions that I ask to make sure that that recipe gets translated. So it is a different skill than the creative process of development. And then there is the testing process, which I think is completely different than the creative process of development, and sort of the literary and language skills for recipe writing. I think of testing as precision, accuracy, and thoroughness. And for me, at least, I have found that I tend to multitask with everything in my life, and testing is not something I can multitask. Even if I try to listen to a podcast, I'll wind up, pausing it because then I lose track of what I'm doing in testing. And I think this step in the recipe writing process, the testing, is probably, I think, to me, the most important part of recipe writing. And I think a lot of people today don't either have, well, especially as I was going to say, in a big kitchen, they oftentimes find that there's just not the budget, or people, when they have to just produce so much, they don't have the time or the money to spend on the testing. But I think recipes that are tested are a reflection of your personal or your professional um, credibility. So I, think that's key. And then there is the editing portion, which is checking for mistakes and inconsistencies. And I'd like to say that this is just all that happens in this stage. But interestingly enough, that in this stage, you ideally are going to just be following a style guide that is either given to you by the publisher or the food company, or your own style guide that you create for your own Substack or blog. But I think sometimes when I get recipes sent to me that I have seen, they either weren't written well or they weren't tested. And so I like to say that I'm almost like doing an editorial test and a complete rewrite. And so sometimes that is the real life, and that's how recipes come to you. But ideally, it's just supposed to be almost like a faster. The next stage is the nutrition analysis, and that is calculating the nutrition information based on the ingredients, the quantity, and the cooking method. And this is an area that I used to do a lot of work with food companies, their nutrition analysis. And I know a long time ago, the Tribune had somebody that did this also for them. But what's interesting today is that most bloggers or anybody online, including the New York Times or digital publications, they're using what they call automated calculators. So they're a program that just sort of grabs the information automatically, like how the recipe is written, to produce a recipe nutrition analysis, where the information in this chapter for me went really deep is that there are people who work in restaurants and they have to have, it's required, the menu labeling, or for food companies with products where there's the FDA, the nutrition facts panel, that there's a lot of intricacy that goes into this. So recipes that are harder to analyze, like sodium that's absorbed when you're cooking pasta or vegetables, or items that are brined or fried. It's a lot more complicated and can be its own workshop. I think for published content today, for just recipes and cookbooks, it doesn't, personally, I don't think it matters as much, but I do think for restaurants and for food companies, it does. And then the final stage is the food styling, photography, and video. It's really the visual storytelling. And this stage is, I would say, and I'm sure everybody on this call would agree, arguably the most important sort of aspect of the recipe are the pictures. And, people who work in this field, food stylists, are super trained and artistic and can make food that, just look mouth-watering. And photography and video, it's really, they're experts in lighting and composition. And, it really is a area unto itself. And I think I've learned so much from others, but I would still say I'd always hire a fabulous photographer to make my food look good. So as I said, we are going to talk about next the writing portion, because it would be a one-day workshop on each of those different parts behind the scenes of creating good recipe content. So I'm going to narrow it down to get to the writing. And I thought it would be just super helpful, since I think recipes, including today, sort of they document a period of time. So I thought I'd start with what is the late 18th century to give us context, because I'm going to move to today. The first American cookbook that was written, 1796, American Cookery. And you can see there is the title, the ingredients and the instructions sort of intermixed. And you can kind of also see that, like, if you really read this quickly, it's, it assumes that the reader knows a lot about cooking. And it does, it's not filled with as many details. It says on there, to add double refined sugar. Today, somebody wouldn't even know, how much to even add. Then going to the mid-19th century, so 1845, there's a book called Modern Cookery by Eliza Acton. She fixes it a little bit. She has the title, then the directions listed first, and then the ingredients listed last. Moving on to the late 19th century, which most people I bet know this book, The Boston Cooking School by Fanny Farmer. This starts to represent what looks more like recipes today, and that's in 1896. There's the title, the ingredients listed first, followed by the directions. And what Fanny Farmer did is, if you can see, she was like the first person to start using these common household measures like teaspoons and cups and tablespoons. And she, within this book, taught people how to properly measure in recipes. And then moving forward to the mid-20th century, we have another recipe change. We have the title, of course, but then the recipes start to have yield and number of servings. And then at the bottom, at this time, it's often common to see something with recipe notes. And the Heinz cookbook I know everybody, like, we could just talk about it. I love old historical recipes, but this is, I have like stacks of these old food company pamphlets and books, and it's just so interesting to see how they're done. That would be a whole nother talk. And then we have what happened in the 1950s, where the whole color food photography really took off. And that's only to note because of recipes today. That was sort of the big splash that happened in the 1950s. And then we move further to the late 20th century to 1982. Everybody, I'm sure, knows this book, The Silver Palette Cookbook. And what happens that's a little bit different that's added is the recipe headnote. And yes, recipe headnotes did happen earlier in a lot of those other publications, but this time it became just so common for people to be sharing their stories and also giving lots and lots of tips to their readers. And that's what people just loved about these cookbooks. And then when we move to today, we basically have, as I say, a recipe headnote that is really long because it's just really giving so much detail to the reader throughout, interjecting where they could buy things, giving them suggestions, and obviously the visual, what they can expect at each stage. So the recipe headnote would write it really succinctly. Now in a blog, this is Deb Perlman's Smitten Kitchen, you can see that. And here, so then there's the recipe video, but you see that there's still the servings, the ingredient list, and then the directions, if you note, here are just what is called like in a paragraph style. There are no numbers associated with it. Even though people use recipe nutrition information today, she does not have any on her website. Whereas the New York Times, it has the prep time, cook time, the recipe headnote, and as you scroll down, you'll see that they use numbered steps. It's not a right or a wrong, it's just a different style. And they also have an automated calculator to help with the nutrition information. And the nutrition information is sort of interesting because there was a woman for the New York Times, it was Jane Brody, who wrote for the New York Times in like the late 80s, and she had the Good Food Cookbook, and her cookbook did not have any nutrition information. But, there were others that came out later, like in the early 90s, that started to have them. But even that's interesting to look at because they would have something like, calories and fat, not saturated fat. It would just be fat and maybe sodium. But like, that's another thing that you can kind of see the way we can look at health and wellness through recipes is also a pretty interesting thing as well. So before we transition into what I feel are going to be my 5 tips to a really well-written recipe and how anybody here can just sort of take my ideas and do it on your own work, I found this video that actually I think is so funny. And actually, there's another fellow person who also has shared this on one of her talks, Kristen Donnelly, who's a really great food writer herself. But when I was watching this show, I thought, oh, this is just so fabulous to sort of tee up the importance of why clarity is important in recipe writing.
Okay, next. Now's the time to sprinkle in the chili pepper flakes.
We've already done that.
What number are we on?
Oh my God, is this not your mother's recipe?
Yes, and now I'm passing it on to you. So try to keep up. Oh, next step is to fold in the cheese.
What does that mean? What does fold in the cheese mean?
You fold it in.
I understand that, but how do you fold it? Do you fold it in half like a piece of paper and drop it in the pot, or what do you do?
David, I cannot show you everything.
Okay, well, can you show me one thing?
Here's what you do. You just fold it in.
Okay, I don't know how to fold broken cheese like that.
I don't know how to be any clearer. You take that thing that's in your hand
Uh-huh.
and you
If you say fold in one more time.
says fold it in.
This is your recipe. You fold in the cheese then.
Don't you dare.
You fold it in.
David! Oh, good. Now I see bubbles. David, what does burning smell like?
Okay, so I think that is sort of, to me, why it's so important that clarity is important. Not everybody is an expert, and we could probably all open up the microphones on this and talk about which direction recipes should go, and should, as Scott said at the beginning, should you hold the reader's hand all the way through, or are we doing a disservice to teaching people how to cook by not giving them more leeway? That should they be so precise? I mean, or not, right? So I'm a believer that you should write to, I don't want to say the lowest common denominator. I would say that you should write to the novice cook. And for somebody who is more expert, you're going to only confirm their expertise to themselves. And they are going to feel good about that. And if you are a recipe writer or a recipe a cook that just improvises, you're going to improvise no matter what's in front of you anyway. So I say write to the people who actually want to follow your recipe. So the number one cardinal rule in recipe writing is to list the ingredients in the order they are used. And that would be, we've got canola, roasted, fresh ginger, soy sauce. And you want to write the directions in the order that they are listed in the ingredient list. And I know this sounds so simple, but I can't tell you how many recipes I've edited where that's different. So then you have pork. A lot of people would probably have put pork first, but you're not asking the reader to use that first, so it doesn't belong first. The pineapple chunks, it goes down. So this is what seems, again, so simple, but you'd be surprised at the number of recipes that I've edited that don't have them in order. And oftentimes, which is not a tip, but like to reread your own recipes, because oftentimes there are missing ingredients in the ingredient list, or they're missing telling the reader what to do with them in the directions. So my next tip would be, yes, I think be specific and clear with how you write ingredients and how you write directions. So for the ingredient list, I would say, think of it as a shopping list. So when you're writing a recipe, create your recipe like you're writing that list that consumer is going to go to the store, and provide a can, a box, or a package size. So yes, you can just write one bag of spinach, and obviously using a bag of spinach, no matter what size it is, in most recipes, I'd say whatever, it doesn't matter. But, the problem is the consumer is going to potentially ask themselves, well, what size bag should I use? So you might as well give them a range. And it's not a big deal, but at least they'll feel more confident. And the same for an ingredient description. So you have a recipe and you're wondering, okay, 1 cup breadcrumbs. And the reader can ask themselves, is that fresh or dried? So just go ahead and tell them what to buy. And that would also be for ingredients that are super hard, like canned tomatoes. There are so many: petite diced, whole peeled, pureed, crushed. Again, give a description so it makes it easier for them. And then I would also say for ingredients, it's the same thing. It's like, I always think about you know, what questions are probably going on in the reader's hand. And so in the reader's mind. And so you're cooking something, you're telling them to put it to a simmer. Well, tell them to lower the heat. Should they cover it or not? I can't tell you, you know, that's like a common question people might have. Same with if they're mixing a mixture in a bowl and then you say to pour it in a 9 by 13 pan, people are going to wonder, well, geez, am I supposed to grease the pan or not? And then I would say for instructions that you want to like try to help them not have a kitchen mishap, like pureeing hot soup. So, you know, if you just say, you know, cook the soup and then puree and serve in some sort of short way, I would say that, you know, it would be a lot more helpful if you ask them to cool the soup, to not fill the blender all the way, maybe half to 2/3 full, and to put it on low speed to start. It's really detail, but it's detail that will help them be successful, which is the main point. And then I would just say this is like all forms of writing. I think it's harder to write short than long. So when someone tells you in 3 long paragraphs how to do this pie dough and you kind of like your eyes are glazed over when you could have just said it more clearly in a paragraph, that you just, again, want to try to think who's reading this and make it easy for them. I'd also say it goes back to the video, right? It's like you're going to use a chefy term like fold. Well, why do you need to use that with mac and cheese when you can just say maybe mix in gently? And if it's an angel food cake where fold in like the egg whites really matter, well, then you could explain to them how to do that technique. Otherwise, it's just, I don't know. I feel like it's just not being very helpful. I'd also say that it's great to pay attention to ingredient modifiers. The modifier meaning what is the preparation method within the ingredient list that you're asking them to do. So a modifier like the word cooked doesn't seem like a big deal, but where you place that modifier matters. So you've got 2 cups cooked rice. It's very clear. But then you have something 2 cups rice cooked. And the latter, the rice, where you take raw rice that's 2 cups and you cook it, that produces 4 cups of rice. Where maybe for that recipe, it may matter to have that additional amount in there. And that the flavoring and the seasoning is all not to scale on that size. So yeah, so which one? Just be clear. And then the same thing with, this was sort of maybe harder to explain, but there are little nuances like, you know, to measure melted butter. So you write 3 tablespoons melted butter. And to me, I read that and I say, okay, are you asking them to melt the butter and then measure it into 3 tablespoons? Or are you just asking them to take a chunk of that stick, take 3 tablespoons and then melt it? So it's all these like sort of details that really can mess things up. And again, I think where it can get most difficult is with baking, this specificity, but I think it even can in savory as well. So it's good to pay attention to how you use your modifiers. My 4th tip would be to provide a time and a visual cue for doneness. And I think this is really important because everybody's ovens and stoves are different, and you know, ingredients are different. Just equipment is different. I just think that you can't really help the reader know when to sort of go on to that next step without giving them a visual cue. So instead of just saying roasted tomatoes for about 40 minutes, give us something that's more visual, like roast the tomatoes until they start to collapse and a few brown spots, you know, appear about 40 minutes. That's a super helpful tip. My 5th tip would be go back and check your prep time, your cook time, and your yield. And the reason why I say that this was actually a COVID picture of mine on my left, where I had all of my kids home, which I guess also I think about all the things I've done work-wise with recipes, but I guess I didn't mention I'm a mother of 3 adult children, of which I cooked a daily meal for them for like 27 years. So it's like I really understand the home cook also. And so I really appreciate this idea that I was making poke bowls and there was all this chopping that I was doing and I was prepping ahead. And, you know, I see recipes at times that'll say prep time is like 10 minutes. And it's like, you're going to really frustrate the reader when they're still chopping at 30, 35, 40 minutes. And I always say that I chop pretty fast. So I usually even add on a little bit of time for my recipes. Same with cooking. So it's something like you'll read a recipe and you're like, okay, is this right? You've got caramelized onions. They'll say the prep time or the cook time is 5 to 10 minutes. And you yourself as a cook will know that takes at a minimum 45 minutes to caramelize onions. Like it's just sort of a red flag. Both the recipe writer didn't know or didn't test or something. But again, I would go back and look at that because to me, those type of details are important and is a tip, I think. And then something like the yield. So you have soup, for example, and people are entertaining and they have a yield 4 to 6, 6 to 8. And it's like, well, how much is it? A half a cup per 1.5 cups, a 2-cup serving. And so I think it's always nice to be able to be more accurate in that regard. And that kind of leads me to the last one, which is this picture of this pasta, because when people do nutrition analysis, they want to really know they've got to do it based on the servings that are in the recipe. And so pasta, this is one thing that I often notice, like when I see recipes with health claims, etc., you know, they'll have a pound of pasta where it is serving, you know, 8 people. And I was like, I always think to myself, I don't know who makes a pound of pasta and thinks that that's going to serve 8 people, even if the nutrition information is more palatable to the reader. So I'm really aware of that detail in my recipes. And I think that's what I would advise to others as well, is be realistic to the serving size that people actually eat. And then, as I said earlier, I really think the most important step in recipe writing is actually the testing of the recipe, because nobody likes to have an expectation of one thing and the reality being something else. You know, and I can go on and on. I mean, I could talk all about testing, but maybe just questions. So this is my book. It's I'm usually like in real life, which is maybe why I've never even asked to come speak at the Culinary Historians. I don't usually like to talk and talk and talk and talk, but I do really think this book is a really great book. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and the Eat Right, which is the Academy's publishing their store. You know, as Scott has said, it's interesting. There hasn't been a book written like this in 25 years, and so much in the publishing industry has changed. And, you know, I did my best to really give anybody who wants to either start out really solid information that they could use. And for anybody who feels you know, comfortable in one area, they could become better in another. And I mean, I even reference back to my own book when I can't remember things that I wrote that I know are super helpful for me. And I guess my last slide is if anybody wants to contact to ask me any questions or anything, always happy to do that. I wish that for so many people out there that I could just give everybody a copy of the book, but it's so expensive. And because that would be more my style here. Just have it. The Academy would not like me to say that, but I usually, I think that's where it comes from, is that my personality really is to want to make others successful. I've often been behind the scenes doing things, and I'm very happy to help, and especially for this next generation of content creators. But I know if, you know, I'm happy to answer any questions from anybody on anything. And I always find people's questions are interesting too, because it gives me ideas of what people are sort of thinking. And God, there's a lot in the chat. But anyway, so Catherine and Scott, thanks so much.
Thank you. That's it. Again, I was one of these people who had no idea how much went into recipe writing. I have a few questions for you. Can you talk a little bit about what a headnote is? Again, that's something that most people, including me, I was not aware of it. And from taking headnote writing classes, like with Dory Greenspan and people at the conference, Hemingway could have qualified to write headnotes. I mean, there's so much artistry and stuff involved in it. What is a headnote, and what should a good headnote do?
Okay. So 2 questions. First off, I would say the actual recipe itself is technical writing, and the actual head note is creative. It kind of is the one and only place in the recipe. Well, I think you can have a voice in the directions, no doubt. That's what makes a recipe original. But I think the head note, Scott, as you said, I mean, I'm not a Hemingway in my head note writing, but I think it's really a place where you can really shine and show your um, writing skills in a much more like wonderful and lovely way. I mean, head notes can serve so many purposes. They can tell a story and elicit, food memory and give context to the recipe itself through your own perspective. It can also give context within the recipe to the culture of where a recipe came from, sort of the history of it. I always think a head note is the perfect place, ideal place to give credit to where that, where your recipe got inspiration from. So I either, got this idea from this restaurant, or I was cooking with Scott and he had showed me his mother's Mandelbrot. He gave me a messy blah, 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 and I've created it into blah, blah, blah. And so I think it's like, a head note, depending on the type of writer you are, can serve so many different purposes. It can even give people tips on how to make something ahead for Thanksgiving. It can be, where you can, explain an ingredient and what you can use as a substitution and why you're giving that substitution in the actual written recipe. So I agree. I don't think all people need to be Hemingway to write a
No.
head note, but I do think that it is a different form of writing than the actual recipe itself. And I think that is sort of the biggest differentiator on how I think of it. But also sometimes head notes get to be like, not to go answer too long. So, but like you look at blogs and like when people would say, oh, I just, God, just stop, just get to the recipe, right? Part of me is like, I kind of enjoy reading and understanding who is creating this and sharing this with me. But you have to, ask yourself, do people really care if you were on Martha's Vineyard all summer and this was, your favorite recipe? I don't know. So it's really a matter of personal style, head note writing.
And I guess head note writing should whet the reader's appetite for doing the recipe. And you said something before, and I'll maybe paraphrase it or say the same thing. In writing, there's this expression, and you already said this, I didn't have time to write it short, so I wrote it long. We're keeping it brief and to the point is so difficult, but
so hard.
So
It's
hard.
so hard. And yeah, I mean, this book, for whatever it's worth, is over 400 pages. And I got to a point where done was good enough, but I felt like I could just keep writing and writing. And I'd even reread my own writing. And I'm like, oh, I could say that shorter. That's not clear enough. And finally, I just said I had to be done.
And something else about cookbooks too. I didn't realize this years ago. I tried making things and it didn't come out well. And I thought I was a bad cook, and it wasn't me. The recipes were bad. And I think I really want to bring that out. So many books have bad recipes or recipes that aren't tested. I guess that's why somebody like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like Ina Garten is beloved because she tests and tests and tests and makes sure you won't screw up and have something delicious. And then you won't think, I can't cook. I don't want to cook anymore. So
Scott, I couldn't agree more with you. I think what I learned over the years when I was starting out and I did recipes myself as a child and they wouldn't work, or even a young teenager. And I'm always like, oh, this didn't work. It must be something that I'm doing. But really what I came to really learn over the years is that recipes were just so poorly written, so many of them, that even as an adult, like I could read, I could cook, they just didn't always work.
And again, that's the genius of Julia Child. She loved people so much. She wanted you to enjoy yourself and enjoy food and enjoy the sociability with cooking, that she wanted to take your hand and hold your hand and guide you. So, and that's what is not easy to do. And that's what you're helping to try to show people how to take people's hand and do it the right way.
Yes.
And I have another saying too, nothing is simple. So,
Nothing simple.
yeah, and that goes
I
for
mean,
recipe.
that's the funniest thing about recipes is it's just like from like, even if you, when I was telling friends that I was writing this book and they would be like on recipes, no, I'm like, no, it's a resource book on how to write recipes. And it's like, how hard can it be to write a recipe? They would say. And I'm like, it could be really hard. It's a whole process. It's you know, it really did at one point in this area of food publishing, it took a whole team, and there are still whole teams of people that do it, but it's a lot harder than one thinks.
And writing a
More
recipe
time
for,
consuming.
I'm sorry, writing a recipe for scrambled eggs is no easy feat. So, and finally, my last question, and everybody, I hope you are sending in chat questions. Kathy will read them to Raeanne. But my final question is, when it comes to testing a recipe, what is involved with that? I picture somebody testing recipes. How do you eat all that food? What do you do with all the food? I mean,
Yeah.
I can't imagine what's involved with the volume of food you have to make, and what goes on with that.
Well, recipe testing, as I said, is so different than the creative process development, different than the writing. I would say it is sort of more like it brings back my science background. So it's more like being in the kitchen, getting everything out, getting all your mise en place, or in this case, everything that you've prepped for the development. You are, measuring the whole food. You're perhaps weighing it, measuring what it produces when it's chopped. You are timing yourself from the beginning to the end. You are making notes on flavor, on texture. You're making notes on the ingredient list, the size, if it works or not. It's sort of like, how I had said that the preciseness. It's like you're not just sort of winging it, even how I cook at night. I don't even pay attention to what I'm doing. But testing is, you are literally going through it like you're doing, I don't want to say a science experiment because that doesn't sound very appetizing, but it's very controlled and measured, and you're producing. And even when one thing that I do is, like, as an example, I will do something like salt to taste. A lot of recipe writers do that. And so what I test a recipe, I'll measure out a quantity of salt in my ramekin. And so when I'm salting to taste, I will actually then see the amount of salt that I used, and I will write that in my test, that, a suggestion to salt with, 3/4 of a teaspoon or whatever was used in that ramekin. So it's really just about precision. That's how I would say it. And gathering all of your equipment. It's all like the stuff you learn in culinary school. It's being exact and clean and precise.
And then what do you do with all the food that
Oh,
you have left
okay.
over?
So I'm a very slight person, so I'm always tasting and then sharing. So that's how it goes. And as I was raising I have 3 kids, as I mentioned. 2 of the boys just ate everything. To them, it was nothing, no problem. It was not a taste. It was like a full meal, and they wanted more when I retested. So
So I guess the answer for doing recipe testing in a good way is to have lots of kids to eat all the food.
lots of kids or lots of friends,
Yes.
whichever, or it's just good leftovers, or you plan it into your week. But yeah, I mean, I could comment in so many things. It's sort of like for people today who are creating content, and they stop and they take pictures. It is kind of hard to like test a recipe and say, okay, this is what's for dinner, because it may not always work, or you can't just do it really quick and get dinner on the table. It's a longer process.
And have a big garbage can too, maybe.
Yeah.
And anyway, Kathy, if you could take it away with the questions, and thank you, Raeanne.
Thanks, Scott.
I don't like to throw away food. There's always somebody you can give it
There's
to.
always somebody I never throw away food. I don't like to do that either, Catherine.
Do you eat your mistakes?
No.
I do, up to a point, and then I
Okay,
just
no,
say to
because
heck.
I made some really bad gluten-free chocolate chip cookies.
Oh, okay.
No, they went,
Okay,
that
gotcha.
went in the trash. I couldn't even share.
Would you compare your book to recipes with type?
Recipes into type?
Into type, sorry.
Yeah, I would. There were 2 really fabulous books that I was trained on myself. Recipes in a Type and the Recipe Writer's Handbook. And I think my book is very similar. It's just a more updated version. And, you know, things have changed in
Sure.
publishing industry. But I think that book, those books are fabulous. So, you know, they think you can still purchase them. I think my book is just more comprehensive and more modern. That's how I would say the difference, but they're great books.
Oh, I just want to say yours is the new and improved Bible of recipe writing.
Well, I'm hopeful that it will be the industry standard for people to use. Thanks, Scott.
Yes.
I'm certain it will be. Okay, I'm sorry. So I'm going through and reading through the list. So it's so rare they come. So this was sometime earlier, but I'm guessing your recipes, they come to the copy editor ready to just have style applied. Copy editing, cookbooks, recipes is a lot more than that, which I guess you've said all along.
Well, it is more than that, but even within, so in the book that, in my book, there are recipes that show how to do some of the things that I reference. And I try to get recipes from other dietitians to contribute. And a lot of them needed to be very edited. And I edited them, but I also had a recipe editor edit my edits. So she even did like another level. So I think she, you know, did a lot of copy editing, but I think like so many things you can edit it to death, but I really value a really good recipe editor or copy editor, because even yourself, you can look at a recipe and you yourself miss things because you're so close to it, you can't see anymore.
That's why you need that third party.
Yeah.
Annette said, what I find so taxing nowadays is that almost each time when I am looking at a recipe on a blog or on Instagram, they start with, I was born in, writer has to give us her whole life story, and you have to scroll and scroll and you finally see the recipe.
Well, the only thing I could say is that I think, and I'm not an expert, but I think at one point Google ranked their sites better when they included all that recipe content, or
And over 500 words.
yeah. So there was a reason why people were doing that. And I do think then there was a thing where you can skip to recipe. But the only thing I could say to be a little bit more empathetic to those people creating the content, I agree that, you know, so many people are short on time and they don't even care. But I think if somebody does a really good job with their writing, I think it can make you feel more close and connected to the person who's sharing their recipes. So maybe it's being more particular about who you're following and where you're gathering so you can have that connection with the person.
And I find I will drag down to the recipe to see what it's all about. But then sometimes they have specific ideas and thoughts about how to process an ingredient, and that is useful to know. So then I'll go back and look at it.
Yeah.
But I liked your comment about, you know, the ability to look at something and then give the person who's interpreting your recipe some confidence in their own skills.
Yeah. I think to me, that's always my main goal, is to make somebody else feel successful. Like, it's not to show them how
It's a good ambition.
creative I am.
What's so important in food journalism is to remember that at the core, it's customer service.
Yeah, you're providing a service. Yeah, absolutely.
By the way, when you were going through the different standards of recipes, one that I didn't see, and it was one that I kind of borrowed for a long time, was the joy of cooking. You know, ingredients, what to do with it, the next set of ingredients and what to do with them. But that style has definitely, I think, almost been unique to them, isn't it?
I think it is unique to them. I saw that too, Kathy, and then I was like, that one really sort of stood out as something that they did as sort of a style for the joy of cooking. But it wasn't something, when I looked at all these other cookbooks of when that was published, it really wasn't typically done that way.
What app do you use for keeping notes and pictures?
I use, okay, this could be, so I have, like probably a lot of you, an iPhone, that's my doggy. Passed away at 17.
Oh my, sorry.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I digress. That was, so what app I use? So my iPhone, it comes with the Notes app. And for whatever strange reason, I got some sort of bug in there, and I was panicked because I keep copious notes, just not on food, but on everything. that crashed. And I'll tell you that what I'm so happy about, and I would love to share, it was my son who shared this with me. It was I download the app Microsoft OneNote, one and then note. And it is the best because it allows you to organize and create folders and subfolders and notepads within the folders. I can upload video, I can upload images. It is the note app that I love after a lot of like panic and anger that Apple couldn't fix my problem. So I finally found a solution on my own.
So repeat what the product is again?
Microsoft, which I'm a Mac user, but it's a
Right.
Microsoft product that you can use on your phone. And what it does is that it syncs. So I have the OneNote on my computer and I have it on my phone. And so they just sync up. And so when I'm out, I can write something. I'm always doing that. You know, I just find that I just can't remember things. So if you were to tell me something, Kathy, and I'm out there writing, or like when we did that supermarket tour, right?
Mhm.
I was writing notes.
Oh, yeah.
It
How
was-
many? Oh, you know, that's it. You have to, because your brain only can take up so much. How
Yeah.
many iterations of a recipe do you tend to practice prior to the final recipe?
Well, first of all, it really depends on the type of recipe. I have found my gluten-free baking recipes to go through way too many iterations, and it's frustrating. I'll tell you something that I like to do to shorten the process, because this, I guess, could be a tip. I like to oftentimes go back to my own recipes that I've developed and tweak and reuse, because I feel like, you know, especially today, you know, we don't get paid a lot more than we used to, you know, 20, 25, 30 years ago. So I like to repurpose content. So oftentimes I'll look at my own notes and go back and look at my own recipes. But the time that it takes to develop is really unique to what the assignment or what you're developing.
Jeffrey commented for his ingredient list. He says, I prefer to group ingredients to reflect what will be used at the same time. So if 3 spices will be added together, I know that in prepping ingredients, I can put them in the same bowl.
Right. So I don't know if Jeffrey's talking about to put them on the same line, like a tablespoon each, blah, 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 blah. Or even if you're using it all at the same time, I would say to put it in the quantity. So if you're using like a tablespoon of, I don't know, chopped parsley and, you know, 2 teaspoons of cumin and whatever. Yeah, okay, wait, did he just said no, ingredients separately? So I would still do it even if you add it at the same time. The rule is you do it in the amount. So if you still put the first larger one first down to the third one. You always list the ingredients in the size that you're going to do it in, even if you're adding them all at once.
Rebecca said, okay, when you said someone should describe how to fold in, I realized I probably can't describe it in writing without hand gestures very well. How would you explain it in writing, how to fold in?
Yeah, that's a good one. I would say let's see, I'll do it like whoever just asked. I'm going to start showing you, but I would gently move the, you know, ingredient from top to bottom. That's how I would say to take I'm trying to think, to take your spatula and move the cheese, you know, from the top to the sides around gently.
And perhaps make a quarter turn and then fold
Yes.
again.
And whoever just asked that question, if I get stuck on something, this is another, like I give all these tips, like I'm thinking sometimes I can't even remember the clearest way to write something. And what I'll do is I'll go to cookbook writers that I like, and I will see how they write something. And I'm like, oh, that's so much more clear. And oftentimes even I have kept in the past, like if I'm working on a project, common ways to say something. So I'm saying it the exact same way, or it's like a reference point to me on how to clearly write the same thing that you say over and over again. Like
Is there an app or website that's easy to use to analyze nutrition information?
Yeah, I guess the advice that I would give there is that anything free would be not great. I just feel hands down, because usually the free apps are, I think I remember one, but the free apps, you get what you pay for. And they're oftentimes curated from the users. So they could have just wildly different information. So I would never, as a professional, I would never use a free app. But I do think there's one that I don't even know if the fee is low. Someone can look it up. Chronometer, I think is one. I'd have to even look. I have a paid subscription to it, a nutrition analysis software program that is one that a lot of food companies and restaurants would use. So I'm not really familiar with a lot of the free ones, but this is what I would also say. The website plugins that are the automated calculators, those are just fine for your website. And it's really just an estimate anyway for the consumer. I think that when people write down, 31 milligrams of like whatever, it's like, there's no one. It's like, just round it because it's not exact.
Or I think some of these things, it's good for 2 milligrams, but not 1 milligram.
Yeah, I don't know. I think nutrition information, if you're going to make a health claim or a nutrition claim, you should have your own standards as to what defines those numbers. Like
Okay.
I could talk forever on that topic, but
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. While somebody said, while we strive for originality, if there's a research component, for instance, consulting cooks who come before us, how does one deal with attribution issues and or danger of plagiarism?
okay, that's a great question. And I would say that no recipe is truly original. All recipes come from somewhere. So, the idea that I even think something that I'm creating is original, it came either from an idea of my grandmother or a riff from something that a friend gave me. And, I don't know. It's like, do I attribute everything because every idea of mine comes from somewhere, including maybe something I ate at a restaurant? I think that if it's really closely associated, I think you should. And also, I think people like to know that too. Like,
Oh, sure.
so for a lot of dietitians ask that same question, like, well, how do I write something that's original? And I think if you take a recipe and you're changing 2 or 3 ingredients, that doesn't make it your own. And I guess for me, I think something that's my own is really my voice within the directions, like how I'm telling somebody to make that mac and cheese, including that folding, right? It's like, it may have very similar ingredients, but how you're telling them to do it could be original.
Steve asked a question that I think is kind of good. How do you define mistake? And I'm probably looking at it from the point of view, it's not what I was expecting, not what I wished for.
What is Steve, wherever you are, because I can't see everybody, but mistake like the recipe didn't work, a mistake, or like, can you add?
I think we were talking like, do you eat your mistakes? That kind of a question that I had.
How would I define my mistakes? Yeah.
They're probably not mistakes. They're just the outcome wasn't what you expected.
Well, it's sort of like if someone's going to eat this is very true about this chocolate chip cookie quest of mine for gluten-free, because 2 of my 3 kids have celiac disease. So I have the best chocolate chip cookie recipe, but I have been on a mission to try to make it. But the point is that sometimes they taste, I created something that just tasted so bad that you wouldn't even want to eat it. It's like it had no flavor, or it was like so grainy that I'm like, oh, I'd rather try it again. I don't know. It's not, I don't know. But sometimes other like savory things, I don't know, you could just fix it somehow. Because I don't like to throw out food. Like
I don't either. But by the way, Therese Allen, who spoke to us a few months ago, she's a Wisconsin food writer. She wrote a very, very good book on the Madison County farmers market. She had a good story. She goes, I'm a food writer, and what to do with the amounts of food produced from testing recipes. All I can say is that my neighbors like me a lot. Years ago, when my across the street neighbor were having a meal for friends, and one of the guests asked them who did the cooking in their house, my neighbor's 6-year-old son piped up and said, Therese does.
yeah. Have that neighbor. That would
Yes.
be great.
Oh my goodness.
Kathy,
Yeah, I know.
can I just add something? When you
Yeah.
mentioned Therese Allen, we're so honored to have her here tonight. Therese is like the food writer laureate of Wisconsin. She is so esteemed, and she's one of the founders of the Culinary Historians. I'm not saying the name right, of Wisconsin. that
Wow.
correct, Kathy?
Oh, she's terrific.
She's,
Very knowledgeable.
If I would have known, I would have, Teresa, I would have interviewed you for the book because I tried very hard to get, the best people to interview for this book to provide all these tips to make it even, as best as I could. But so sorry I missed out on interviewing you
next time,
next time.
yes.
Okay, Jeffrey commented, my experience is that virtually all recipes underestimate cooking time step by step and are weak or on the amount of herbs and spices, and I often double herbs and spices and decide the cooking time for myself based on instructions. I don't know. You know what I have started to do is if I'm baking bread,
Uh-huh.
and it's yeast risen bread, I stick my instant read thermometer, it's hit 205 out the oven. If it's banana bread, kind of the instant type breads, that's hits 200 190 plus degrees, comes out of the oven. I'm relying more and more on temperature than I ever did before.
Well, can I tell you what I like about that? I do know people who take the internal temperature of their quick breads, etc. But see, that's another thing, Kathy, I could probably learn from you. That's the thing about, there's always something to learn.
Well, right. And even I've started to learn things like what temperature does custard coagulate? 175. That makes a difference if you do a stuffed pumpkin and you have a custard in there. It's under 175, it just swims onto the table. Not a pretty picture. There's a lot of good comments that I'm sure people have been reading along. And I think they're going to, and you're going to get a copy so you can read about it later.
Oh, okay.
But I think Scott, we're about finished.
Good, because I like to be very cognizant of people's time. On a
I get it. You're
Wednesday
right.
night. But I'm so glad that I came tonight. And Scott, I look forward to seeing you next week in New York.
Can't wait, and again, can't wait to watch you win that award. I'm only
Well,
99% sure.
No, it's just, I feel really happy to have the book just acknowledged and be nominated. So that to me is good enough.
Wonderful. Well, we will see you, and if you need help carrying home the award, if it's too heavy, I will help you with that. And thank you all.
Scott. Okay, really. All right. I have to say thank you everyone for coming on and joining me tonight and choosing to do this on a Wednesday night with us. So
Good night, everybody.
good night.